Thank you everyone for joining us. So happy to have you here this evening. I'm really excited for tonight's talk. We are talking to the founder of Untapped New York, Michelle Young, who is the author of the brand new book, The Art Spy. And Justin Rivers, Untapped New York's Chief Experience Officer, is here to lead that conversation. So I think I'll toss it over to you two. Oh, and if anyone has questions, sorry, if anyone has questions as we go, please go ahead and drop them in the chat. I will keep an eye on the chat the whole night, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So any questions that pop up whenever you feel like it, drop those in there, and I'll be grabbing them.
The more questions, the better.
Yeah.
Really
Yeah.
excited
Bring
about
them on. Well, thank you, Nicole, very much for the introduction. Again, for those of you who don't know us, my name is Justin Rivers. I'm Chief Experience Officer with Untapped New York. I'm here with Michelle Young, who is the founder of Untapped New York, but also just published her new book, The Art Spy, which we are going to be talking about tonight. Very excited. If you haven't read the book yet, you're in for a treat. If you're mid-read, keep going. It's so good. It's hard to put down. I think one of the things I want people to know who don't know us so well is that Michelle and I are very good friends. We and partners in business, so we know each other well. So if this conversation seems a little comfy, it's because, well, I know Michelle very well. I have been talking to her through the process of writing the book, so we have a really unique perspective. And so I guess we're going to start off a little bit with a reading, right?
Yeah, I thought it'd be fun to read the first couple pages of the book. Not all events I've been doing on book tour do I get a chance to do the reading.
Yeah, go for it.
I would love to do that for today's event. All right, so The Art Spy. Paris, August 19, 1944. A torrential storm was pummeling Paris, turning the skies forebodingly dark over a city in the midst of a tense mandatory blackout. The clamor of thunder and the sounds of war rose to a crescendo as the battle for Paris began. After 4 brutal years of German occupation, the City of Light was allegedly going to be liberated. Cannons boomed and shells whistled above the Seine, just meters away from the Jeu de Paume Museum. Inside that 19th century building, 45-year-old French art historian Rose Valland peered out from a slightly open window. The French resistance had ordered a citywide uprising, and 4,000 plainclothes police officers wearing tricolor armbands, the red, white, and blue of the French flag, invaded the police headquarters facing the Cathedral of Notre Dame and took over Paris's city hall, flushing out the Nazi occupiers. The Germans countered with bombs and blasts from their own armored tanks, trying to take the buildings back. Gunfire from street skirmishes rang out throughout the city. Bullets shattered windows and pierced buildings. German soldiers on foot attacked the street barricades built by Parisians out of burned-out cars, furniture, sandbags, barrels, cobblestones, pianos, and even urinals. From the Jeu de Paume, Rose could see dark smoke rising from the Grand Palais, the glorious palace of iron, steel, and glass on the Champs-Élysées that was used throughout the occupation for propaganda exhibitions. The Germans had sent a remote-controlled tank barreling into the building to kill the French resistance fighters who had barricaded themselves inside. At just under 5.5 feet tall, Rose was dwarfed by the scale of the Jeu de Paume's colossal arched windows, but there was nothing timid about her. 4 years earlier, the Nazis had seized the museum to make it a headquarters for its art-looting force, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, to process the Jewish-owned art they had begun to plunder en masse in France. Her boss, Jacques Jaujard, the director of the Musées Nationaux, the French National Museums, immediately ordered her to, quote, remain at all costs at the Jeu de Paume Museum, end quote, and covertly spy on the Germans. Iron-willed Rose was determined to see her orders through, but she did not know that she would risk her life for the next 4 years to achieve her mission. Rose had a reputation for being overly serious and too blunt for her own good, but her unflappability had proven useful in the war. She had learned to play the role of a nobody to the Nazis, not important enough to notice, not congenial enough to be flirted with, and too grave to be easily friends with. Unlike the other women who worked in the French museums, she didn't bother much with her looks. Her most defining accessory was her round spectacles, which gave her an air of erudition. Although it was in vogue to wear one's tresses in soft waves just above the shoulder, Rose simply brushed her brunette locks to the side and pulled them back in a neat bun. She left her eyebrows natural and mildly unkempt, unlike those popularized by cinema stars like Arletty and Daniel Derieux, who wore them razor thin and drawn in darkly with pencil. Sartorially, Rose did her best to fit in. Though she would have much preferred to wear pants, she donned feminine, ankle-length dresses and blended in with the rest of the women in Paris, modest, traditional, and discreet. Still, the Germans had accused Rose of everything in their arsenal: sabotage, theft, and signaling to the enemy. They subjected her to invasive interrogations and searches, and even expelled her from the museum on several occasions. But she talked her way back in every time, explaining calmly that she was just a lowly employee of the French National Museums, who oversaw the building's maintenance and the remaining art collection. In reality, she was one of the most well-educated art historians in France, and nearly every one of the German accusations had been true.
That's a great place to end that intro. And I think it leads really into the first question, which is, again, for those of you who don't know you well, your background in architecture, obviously founding Untapped New York, and working for years in all things New York, basically. Why Rose Valland? Why this story? What drew you to it?
Well, the big thing was I couldn't read anything about New York in my spare time. Everything would be triggering, right? Like, we need an article about that.
Right.
Let's make a tour. Let's do a talk. And you know how you and I get like really obsessive and want to,
Yes.
we try to execute all of our ideas, which leads us, down interesting paths and makes us really tired. But we love the creative process. I think both of us, right? And so instead, I decided to read World War II books. And the reason for that is my own family's history. My grandfather survived the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. He was a Taiwanese student studying in Japan, so kind of got swept up into the war in Asia. And both my husband, Augustin, who runs Untapped New York, is the CEO now, both of his grandfathers were medaled for their bravery in World War II. And so once I was dating him and marrying him, I said, why don't I go deep dive into French and really European World War II history? That always fascinated me growing up. I loved studying it in high school and in college. And it was like a real opportunity to go deep into something and enter it through the lens of France,
Yeah.
which I would have never expected to do. And it was new and fresh, right?
Right.
So that was my interest in World War II. But I discovered Rose in one of the many books I had been reading. For a while, I was reading only books about female spies, World War II. Pretty much never left, right?
Yeah.
Then I wrote a book. But I read a book called Goring's Man in Paris by Jonathan Petropoulos. And this is about Goring's art dealer in Paris. And he's in the Jeu de Paume Museum, which I mentioned. He's been assigned there as an art historian and PhD. And he's there allegedly to document the art that's been looted, but he really serves as Goring's personal shopper throughout the years of the war. And Rose Valland appears every few chapters in this book. And I was like, this woman is amazing. Like, I immediately felt something about her that I wanted to know more, and was really surprised that I hadn't heard of her, because I had read biographies about female spies, compilation books like D-Day Girls and all sorts of compilation books, and she doesn't come up in them.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing that I discovered when I was actually researching the book is that a book came out in 2019 in France, and it's a compilation of over 200 female resistance members, and Rose does not appear in it.
What?
So she's been
wow.
regularly erased over
Yeah.
time for many reasons, which I'm sure we can get to.
Yeah.
But yeah, something really spoke to me about Rose's story, and I wanted to dig in, as you know we do.
Yes. And you did it with that fervor that's only you. You did everything you could. You went to these places. Actually, that's one of my questions. We can go
Yeah.
there. I mean, you traveled extensively to research the book all over the globe. You spent a lot of time in France. I know you did
Yeah.
a lot of work here in New York. We can even talk about your little writing room in the New York Public
Yeah.
Library, so jealous about.
I would say like the first thing I did was, even before I had a literary agent, even before I had a book deal or anything, it was just the seeds of an idea. And I was extremely pregnant with my second daughter,
Yeah.
Emma. I was so ill during this pregnancy. So I had the idea, but I literally couldn't do anything. And that summer, starting to feel better, we were in France, and I said to Augustin, can you bring me to Rose's
I
hometown?
remember this trip.
And
I
that
remember
was
telling
the
you.
very first thing I did.
Yeah.
And in her hometown, when I got there, there is a Place Roosevelt, Plaza Roosevelt, basically, but it's the parking lot of the post office. And I was like, I think I know everything I need to know right now about where her legacy lies.
Yeah.
And then I went to the town hall, and they also said, we don't really know much about her, but here's the phone number to the Roosevelt Association and the woman who runs it. And that turned out to be one of the most amazing contacts. And I held on to that like gold because I didn't have a book deal. So I didn't want to contact her with no project. I
Right.
didn't want to waste her time. So I waited almost a year before actually reaching out to her.
Yeah.
Jacqueline is her name, Jacqueline Bartolet.
Yeah, and so you got to speak to these amazing people to give so much color to Rose's life, and you went to so many of the places that you have written about in the book. What was sort of a highlight? I mean, I remember you telling me the story about going to Rose's home village. Were
Yeah,
there other highlights of those trips? Anything that was
Of
like,
course.
oh my God? you know?
yeah. I mean, meeting her descendants
Yeah.
was so key.
Mhm.
And they welcomed me to their home. We had croissants
Yeah.
and tea. It was so lovely.
Amazing.
But I think, there's a secondary storyline in this book, which takes us through Spain and Portugal to New York. It's the
Right.
story of the Rosenberg family.
the
Paul Rosenberg, who was the art dealer to Picasso, Matisse, Leger Braque, the exclusive art dealer to those artists. And I got to go into the building that was their gallery in their house, this massive building in Paris. And actually, I was able to get in because I emailed every single business there.
Oh,
And Veolia, the infrastructure company, got back to me, super excited.
oh, really?
And so their head of buildings there took me through and then brought me to all the other businesses so I could see all the floors. And that was a real architectural treat. I brought a friend from Columbia where we were in school together in architecture school. And we looked at the old photographs and tried to place where everything was. And actually everything is still there. It's just like some places are siphoned off and we had to locate it. So that was really special to sometimes you can't go into these buildings anymore because they've been privatized and other
Right.
things. And similarly, there was a very castle-like building that they stayed in when they fled Paris and fled central France. They ended up near Bordeaux. And that house, which looks like a castle in this beautiful parkland, now belongs to the town. And so the town let me take a visit in
Oh,
there.
wow.
And it's abandoned inside. So it hit so many
Oh,
points
that
you
that
and
hits
I
all the
love.
notes.
Yeah, but that part was just also incredible to be in this like huge echoey space and feel the ghosts and the people that have come through and the real life and death decisions that this family had to make to decide. And there was a big disagreement. Do we leave France or do we not leave France?
Yeah.
And that was very, very moving for me.
It was interesting too, because as I was reading, I knew what your book was about. We've talked about Rose off camera many times.
Mhm.
I didn't know about these Rosenberg, the family. And I noticed you had sort of set up this parallel story track throughout the book. And, I'm thinking, all right, well, Paul Rosenberg, obviously a big dealer to very big names we know
Yeah.
very well. And then, of course, you introduce his son, Alexandre Rosenberg. And I know that there's a New York tie because they end up in New York. But then you realize there was just one point where it was, Picasso is Alexandre's godfather. And I'm like,
Yeah.
how many people could say Pablo Picasso is your godfather? And then I don't want to give too much
Mhm.
away
There's-
because I understand completely why you set it up that
Yeah.
way by the end of the book. And it's such a beautiful moment at the end
Yeah.
of the book. And you recognize how important this art was not only to Rose, not
Mhm.
only to sort of the Jewish population of France who had gotten it sort of confiscated,
Yeah.
but to France's cultural identity as a country.
Right. I wanted to give all of that context because Rose is an amazing character and
Yeah.
obviously very inspirational for me. But if we stick with just her and her spy work in the museum, which is exciting.
Yeah, very
exciting. She's also doing stuff outside of the museum.
Right.
There is cloak
Yes,
going on.
there is.
But you might not get the sense of the human impact that this art looting has done, right?
Right.
You might get, when you read other stuff about Rose, it's about how much artwork did she save, lists and lists of and reports and stuff. But what does that translate to, right?
Yeah.
That all of that art that just ended up on lists, they were on the walls of these families' homes that were confiscated and really like once the Nazis arrived in France and in any other occupied country, they set up their government and then they started looting
Yeah.
immediately. Those things went hand in hand. And I don't know if the general public sees that tie, that
Right.
how important art and architecture was to the regime and the looting and how it was all linked together and the gradual stripping of not just property, but rights and citizenship and then deportation to the camps. That's all one line. And so by telling the story of the Rosenbergs, we can humanize what happened
Yeah.
to Rose, to the Rosenbergs, to the Jewish population in general in France.
Yeah, and that was very apparent, even with the detail that you went into with sort of Alexandre's mother being like, please just come to New York or get out of the line of fire. You know, these are conversations I would have had with my mother at the time. So you're dealing with very, very human people. But again, to bring it back to the art, there was a staggering, I took a bunch of quotes
Yeah.
from the book. And well, first of all, this is amazing to me. And, you know, we can go back and forth here, but today, this is directly from the book.
Mhm.
Today, it is believed that over 100,000 pieces of Nazi confiscated artwork taken from all over Europe have yet to be discovered.
Yeah.
As of today, there's still that amount of art.
Yeah,
out in
and
the
those
world.
numbers are grossly underreported because the Nazis would only catalog the most important pieces of
Yeah.
art, but they were confiscating apartments wholesale. You know, the minute a family was deported, they just went in. And initially, it wasn't the apartments of the families. Initially, it was the 15 most important galleries in Paris. They had a list of those, and they went and they sent commando units. So the Rosenberg family's galleries were first in that list.
Yeah.
And where was I?
Yeah. No, so we were basically just talking about how this
Oh,
is
the scale.
gross. Yeah, the scale.
Right,
of
and
it.
so the 100,000 comes from a larger number, they say 650,000 works of art were looted,
It's crazy.
but that doesn't include furniture and stuff that
Yeah.
might not have been cataloged and
Right.
all sorts of other precious items.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's bring it back to Rose for a minute, because I
Yeah.
think one of the things that you do really well is, let's face it, people, when they think of historical or narrative nonfiction, they think it gets a little bit bogged down in detail and a lot of heavy research. And I read it all the time for work and for pleasure. This read like a cross between a spy novel and really fast-paced narrative nonfiction.
Yeah.
So what was that like? Rose's story is really the white knuckler, the one that you clench and you go, is she gonna pull
Is
this
she gonna
off?
make
You
it?
know?
Yeah.
And how was the balance between that and making sure every T was crossed and every I was dotted with the facts?
Yeah, so of course I love books in this style,
Yeah.
the female spy narrative nonfiction genre, a favorite genre of all time for me. And so I was familiar with the type of pacing that's needed for these books to read like
Yeah.
fiction. But then I've got that other side of my brain that's the research-based archival
Right.
academic side. And so when I first started this process, I never did those two things on the same day. The writing and the research actually happened usually on different days
Different things.
because there was also so much to process. And in order to make something vivid with that much detail, you need to have a really wide net
Yeah.
of sources because one whole avenue of inquiry, one archive might yield like an adjective
Right.
in a sentence or at best a sentence, but you need that color. So you can feel that you are there with Rose, you're there with Alexandre, you're there with whoever the main character in that chapter is. And so, yeah, the division of labor happened at the beginning. And then as the book was more complete, I could do them simultaneously. But I also similarly wrote this book sans outline. I just knew that I was covering the wartime years of Rose's life, that I had the two storylines that I hoped would pan out.
Mhm.
And I knew that if Alexander's storyline, if I couldn't find enough information, I might need to just chuck everything that I had written.
Right.
But so sort of at the end of each chapter that I wrote, I would think to myself, like, where does it need to go next? As the reader, who have we missed character-wise? Where does the story need to go? What do we need to cover next? And so I think a lot of people have spoken about the thrilling pacing of this book because I really discovered it as you guys are discovering it.
Yeah.
Right? But then it did require putting together so much information, writing it out, cutting a lot of stuff. and deciding what absolutely necessarily needs to be on the page.
Yeah.
It is easy for writers to get bogged down in all the material, but you have to be very judicious and only include what kind of pushes the narrative forward or gives critical informational background to what's happening.
Yeah, I think that was the magic of it. It moved so quick, but you realize the density of information in the format is being transmitted and it moves like lightning speed. And it's great. It just, you really, and I'm not saying this because it's you. I'm not, I promise you this. I would be more judicious in my praise. You can't put it down. Like,
Thanks.
I was literally like up at 1:30 in the morning being like, just stop, just stop, just stop. I remember I got to the point you write so vividly about Hitler's tour of Paris, which
Mhm.
I had never, I knew happened. It's a big part of history, but I never realized his love for Paris or his admiration for Paris.
Yeah.
He had never really been there, but he had sort of admired it.
And studied it academically.
Academically,
right?
yeah,
The
and it
floor
was-
plans and the street layouts.
There was something extremely creepy yet really informative about that. And you did have a lot of insight into Hitler and into
Yeah, I mean, so that chapter, so wherever possible in this kind of book, you want firsthand accounts.
Yeah.
You want those sources. So whether you can speak to someone who was there or you get your hands on their accounts. So really any chapter was a compilation of me tracking down as many firsthand accounts as I could. So in that case, the artists who traveled with him to Paris on that first visit, June 1940, they all wrote stuff about their impressions and the path that they went. And I combined them all.
Yeah.
In a way that would work for the narrative.
It was beautiful, seamlessly stitched together. Because this is going to be very strange for those of you who don't know me. I'm a tour guide. Like that's basically, I'm a chief experience officer. I'm in charge of experiences, but I'm a guide. And I felt like I was on a tour with him. The way that you laid it out, the stops that he made, the time that he had. I didn't realize it was such a short
It was
tour.
like 4 hours.
Yeah, and then he
Very
hopped
short.
and he went back to Berlin.
Yeah.
Like I had envisioned him staying for, a week or whatever. He came, he saw it, he had this, like, again, I think what was creepy was I felt like I was standing next to him when you wrote it. So it's just that amount of detail, which has been incredible. So I guess one of the other things I wanted to talk about, which again was information and a surprise to me, and we'll go back to Rose too, because there's a lot about Rose, but the role of France and France's courage and patriotism, growing up in America and having also family who were veterans, although the family who were veterans of World War II spoke very highly of all of the countries in the Allied forces. But then sort of it gets diluted down the generations where, how cowardly France was in capitulating so quickly to the Nazis. And one of the things that's so beautiful about this book was, actually really how brave so many of the French people were. And it seemed like the art and the culture and Paris in general were the unifying force behind them. Can you speak to that? Because that's a really interesting and great treat of this.
Right. So the book begins in the summer of 1939, where there's clear geopolitical unrest happening in Europe. And the museums in France are beginning to start to execute some of their plans to protect the art. And Rose is a key part of that because she's essentially been left in charge of the Jeu Museum, even though she's been unpaid for 7 years. But her boss is hobnobbing. At some point, he gets recalled to the Air Force because he's a World War I aviation hero. And she's just become intimately familiar with this museum and how it works. So she's the woman in charge at this point. And so for me, the bravery really begins with this collective effort to preserve and hopefully save the culture of France. And it's a monumental effort, right? They're moving the Mona Lisa, the Victory of Samothrace. And so that part is really thrilling. And from my research, came to the conclusion that Rose was very critical in this whole process. And then there's the phony war that happens where nothing happens in Western Europe.
Right.
And then comes the invasion of France by the Germans.
Very quickly.
there we see both Rose's bravery because she's refusing to leave the museum and she's arranged with her bosses and her boss's boss. So basically the head of all of the French National Museums and his boss, the head of the Beaux-Arts Ministry. And she's told them, I'm not leaving. I need to protect the art in this building. There's still a large portion of it in the basement. And that's my job as the curator, the unpaid curator. I'm here to protect the art. And so they initially agree. But then as the Germans are barreling down the gates of Paris, she's ordered by her boss to leave. And he calls her at the crack of dawn. And there's a letter that literally, just a note that she made. And it said, like, it translates to the crack of dawn.
Yeah.
Got a call, said, leave the museum immediately. And also all the guards actually signed this document. It was that important to her that she was forced to leave.
Yeah, yeah.
And I won't give too much away because it's one of the most exciting chapters to
It's
write. But
really
Escape
exciting.
from Paris is harrowing.
Yeah.
Beyond, I think, what we mentioned, and that came from an unpublished chapter that I found of her book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then I ended up finding many versions of it in different archives and in her papers. So that's kind of how that came together. And then finding actually someone else's account of the same escape, just behind her.
Yeah.
And she escapes by boat. So it's sort of a unique way to have left Paris during this time. And I spent 3 days looking for an account, hoping to find someone else who recounted that. Because when I sat down to write it, at first I was like, great, lost chapter, that's
Yeah.
all I need. But then you sat down to write it and you realize you're missing so many details
Mm.
because she reported it in a certain way and someone else will report it a different way. And by putting it all together, now you have the scene alive, right?
And it was alive, boy. I was
Yeah.
like sweaty palms.
And then at the same time, we have the Rosenberg family trying to escape France. They finally decided that they need to leave. And again, harrowing efforts to get passports, visas. They finally are permitted to leave France. And Alexandre
Yeah.
is stopped because France has changed the laws at this point.
Right.
And now anyone over 18 has to report to military service. And so very painful parting at the border with his family. Him and his cousin can't leave. And through his path, I learned what happened after Dunkirk. Nobody talks about that, at least in America. It's
Yeah,
not
nobody
Dunkirk.
talks about it in America, right?
Dunkirk, obviously, they only evacuated a small portion
Right.
of the forces that were there between British, French, Polish.
Yeah.
And so all those people, all those soldiers moved from one port to another as the Germans closed them. They would get to the next one. And so by the time Alexander walks north from the border, he's made it to the last port that's left. And he's there with, again, Polish, British, American soldiers, not American, sorry.
Yeah.
British, French, and Polish.
Yeah.
And he makes the decision, along with many others, that in order to fight for France, they must flee the country. And I think we need to remember or emphasize how transgressive that was, because basically they would be named traitors right away.
Right.
So they get, I don't want to give too much away, but he escapes through that port to fight for Charles de Gaulle. And I worked super closely with the Free France Foundation in France and went to the military archives in France to put together the stories of these men. And it was just so inspiring. And by the time you get to the liberation portion of the book, every time I reread and edited that portion, literally would cry.
It's emotional. It is. I also was brought to tears, but I do want to say also, we talked about this off camera. I learned a lot about Charles de Gaulle through this book. You know, I knew who Charles de Gaulle was. Obviously, I knew how important he was to France, both during the war and post-war, but I had never really kind of understood how pivotal he was to Free France, but also just his demeanor. So do you mind if I sort of bring
No,
out
please.
this scene? I know I don't want to give anything away, but this is incredible. I read this like 5 times and it had me like, wait, what? I'm going to read this one more time. And you said Augustin didn't even know anything about
Yeah,
this.
my own husband
His
grew
friend.
up in France.
Yeah.
He didn't know that this event happened
Yeah.
in the liberation.
So I'm just going to read this because I
Okay.
was like, all right, so here it is from the book. De Gaulle remains standing in the open. So he is inside Notre Dame at this point after liberating the city. De Gaulle remained standing out in the open with a lit cigarette dangling from his mouth. He then walked into the church, repeatedly from the upper galleries unperturbed. He headed straight down the center aisle. Oh, I'm sorry. I missed a very important part there, which was he then walked into the church as snipers shot repeatedly from the upper galleries. Unperturbed, he headed straight down the center aisle. He even repositioned chairs that were knocked over in the panic. The cathedral lit up with ashes of light as the bullets struck the ancient stone walls and ricocheted off. The resistance had the police shot back. People hid below the church pews and the chairs, and inside the chapels, bullets somehow missed de Gaulle every time. And a radio host had marveled, isn't he truly magnificent? Oh my God, it's like he was sent from God. And he's
Yeah,
just
and that radio host was
amazing.
in the church, like reporting,
Reporting.
hiding while
Oh,
all of this was happening.
so incredible.
So I found that audio, and it was amazing. To
Yeah,
hear.
it's
You can
amazing.
hear the bullets.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. And the thought that, okay, great, Paris is liberated, done. Not at all.
No,
Not even
yeah, I
close.
think, when people rewrite history or look back, it's always easier
Right.
to make a narrative clean.
Yeah.
But actually, there was a lot of uncertainty and unrest in Paris, and Rose faces this too.
Yeah.
After the liberation, people think she's a collaborator. Her museum is overrun.
Right.
And
Also very
so
exciting.
there's a lot of things happening in Paris, and it's not just, oh, surrender, liberation. Like there's still fighting that's happening all over the city, even
Yeah.
though Germany has surrendered
Surrendered, yeah.
Paris.
So let's talk about something I think that's very important about Rose, and also
Mhm.
something that differentiates your writing about Rose, which is Rose's personal life, which isn't
Yeah.
really ever tackled in anything else, even in Rose's own sort of
Oh,
biography.
Rose, yeah, she would not reveal anything
Yeah.
personal about herself for sure because of her sexuality.
Right.
And she was also just a real academic. I joked that she needed a PR spin doctor, and here I am.
You gave her the spin. Yeah, exactly.
But she just never wanted to overstate her own achievements. It just wasn't really in her style to market, even though she did persistently fight for the credit that she thought was due to her. And that's very clear in her letters and the records she left behind.
Yeah.
But she wasn't going to go off spouting around. And so I knew that even though there was literally hundreds and thousands of documents left behind from her office, her apartment, the museum's documents, so much stuff to sift through, but it was still hard from that to get a lot of who was Rose.
Yeah.
So over time, the family actually every 6 months would kind of emerge with more
Mhm.
letters. So there's all the quotes, everything in quotes in the book comes from things that people have said or written. So all of that is 100% accurate. But it was sort of collected over time and then inserted into the book as more material came to light. But I also felt that if I could unpack her personal relationship with this woman, Joyce here, who was her life partner, in the end, they lived together for 50 years, that could be perhaps the key to unlocking who Rose was and to humanize this woman that didn't really want to be humanized.
Right.
And so I spent probably about 3 months pretty much focused on Joyce. So I wrote the first part of the manuscript, first version of the manuscript, and Joyce wasn't in it because it was believed that they had met after the war.
Mm.
And then when I was waiting for my book edits, I ended up speaking to Joyce's family and her descendants, and they said, oh, as far as we know, they lived together during the war. Ooh,
Oh, wow.
this is
Yeah.
a problem if so, but a real opportunity
Right.
if so. And so then I set about verifying if that was true,
Mhm.
and then tracking down anything I could find about her. So tracking down all the mundane documents. Basically, I had heard a podcast with, her name is, I believe, Philippa Langley, and she's the one who discovered the body of Richard III under the parking lot.
Oh,
Remember
yes.
this woman?
Yes,
And then
I
she
do.
turned her attention to the two princes.
Yes.
And I heard it right around the time that I was starting this, looking into Joyce. And she was explaining how she tracked down information on a story from the 1400s. And she said that the London Metropolitan Police had told her, you got to treat it like a missing persons investigation. And I was like, yes, this is what I need to do here. And so I found her ID card applications, her job applications, and the big thread that I could pull was that she worked as a secretary at the US Embassy pre-war and during the war.
Right.
And so it turned out the US Archives had a lot of material on her. So I scoured every single communication in and out of the US Embassy during World War II in hopes that I would find her. And she appeared 5, 6 times. And then from there, it kind of, the path led to more things.
Yeah. And it is amazing how much you were able to paint that relationship with what you had. Because there were times in the book I remember reading whatever Rose was up to. And I remember thinking, well, is Joyce with her? Like, during that, it's like, what is Joyce
Yeah,
doing?
and then we get back to Joyce.
Yeah, and then she comes back.
Joyce has a harrowing World War II experience too. And that's an episode that I didn't know about World War II
Yeah,
at all, is the mass incarceration of British citizens
yeah,
in World War II. They were classified as enemy aliens by the Germans. And much like the Jewish population, they were initially told, just check in with the Kommandantur every day. You're basically on parole
yeah.
in France, so you got to check in. And then when they wanted to round them up, they knew all their addresses, so they just went door to door. And then we follow Joyce in the book to where she's taken in eastern France, and it's truly terrible.
Yeah, no, it is. It's truly, yeah, but it's an amazing, like you say, humanizer.
Yeah,
Rose.
because then I looked at, okay, the Germans take over Rose's museum, the looting force, the Nazi looting force essentially takes over the museum at the beginning of November 1st, 1940.
Mhm.
And around a month later, Joyce is arrested.
Yeah,
So I think any of us can imagine, we can put ourselves in Rose's shoes
for sure.
in that instance. And scouring every single communication at the US Embassy, no record that Rose ever went there to even ask what was going on. Because if she did, it would reveal that they were living together.
Correct.
She was living with a British citizen. And of course, the Americans are allies, but as a good spy, you know that if you put that out there, it might come back to haunt you. So I don't believe, and the records don't show that this ever happened, that she even went to check with the US Embassy where Joyce was.
Yeah. It's incredible the amount of, it's even hard to call it sacrifice that goes on between, like you had mentioned, the fact that Rose isn't even paid because of her, chauvinistic overbearing boss. And,
Yeah,
that
the
these,
original boss. He was terrible.
yeah, wow, I can't even say it on line because really awful stuff.
I feel like working on this book as a woman, it gave me a lot of insight because I think women, marginalized populations, we've all come in contact with people that make an assumption about you
Right.
and then decide to immediately denigrate you.
Yeah.
And that's what happened to Rose
Yeah.
in her pre-war life. The head of her school, the École du Louvre in Paris, who was also the head of the museums, the same guy, Henri Verne, took a disliking to her because he had a rivalry with her mentor, her ideas. Her thesis was too modern,
Right.
super popular, like it was a packed
Yeah.
thesis review.
Right.
But he gave her a super bad grade, which basically prevents her from getting a job after the war. So she takes this unpaid secretarial job in the Japon. And anytime someone asked him, should I hire Rose? He would write these like nasty letters
Yeah.
about her.
He'd refuse.
He'd refuse and then like add in like details like about why she was not totally unnecessary to be hired. So I was very gratified when I found in the US Archives that he had served as a middleman to the Nazis,
Yeah.
as an art dealer in the war. The French don't have this record, and I found it in the US National Archives, and I was like, okay, this whole picture started to make sense. And of course, there's been more materials that have come up in the last 20-ish years. And so, whereas him and his cronies all published memoirs, well, he didn't, but his cronies did, kind of puffing him up and resuscitating his reputation post-war. There was another guy in the museum who didn't publish his memoir, but his family published it in 2014. And it details actually his fall from grace before the war.
Yeah.
He was actually fired from his job. This is like not really in the public record at all.
Yeah.
And so once I got my hands on all this material, you start to put together character profiles for everyone. And his became quite clear.
Yeah, no, his was quite clear. And I remember one of his points of downfall was a ship that sank with art on its way
yeah.
to
Yeah.
the 1939.
So
New
yeah,
York
there was like
Fair. So
scandals.
of course
like-
my ears perked up.
yeah,
But
let's talk about
yeah,
that. I would love to
yeah.
talk about. Yeah, so someone one of his employees had embezzled a lot of money from the museum.
Yeah.
A Watteau painting was stolen. Just, like all these things were happening. And then I did go down a big World's Fair.
I remember because
Deep hole for all the New Yorkers listening and Untapped New York fans, that we love the 1939-40 World's Fair. Well, both.
yeah,
64,
both of them.
65 too.
Yeah, but we love them all.
And Justin is the World's Fair expert.
Yeah.
And so when I realized that there was a Rose Valland World's Fair connection, yes.
Yeah, it was so much fun.
And so this came from just one reference that I found saying that she had helped her boss, who had flown to New York to work on the World's Fair. He was here for months. Andre Deservois. That was her boss in the museum itself.
Right.
The curator of the Jeu de Paume. And so I got my hands on that letter, which was in the World's Fair archives. And it wasn't this one wasn't her letter, but it was someone else accounting for what they were going to ship and things they were looking for. And it said like Rose Valland asked me to write this letter to you to recap these things or something. And then from there, I opened up so many World's Fair boxes because those are in the New York Public Library, the whole archive. And honestly, every press release that was released from that World's Fair was like a work of art, a work of literary genius. Like I couldn't stop
meticulous.
reading these
Yeah.
press releases. And there was so much good stuff because basically the event you're referring to is Rose helps to get these huge sculptures by Bourdelle finally shipped for the World's Fair. Her boss is waiting for them there. And the ship sinks at port
Yeah, port.
in Le Havre. And so I really wanted to know about this shipwreck and what happened. And so not only did I comb through the World's Fair archives, I went to the shipping archives of that shipping company in Le Havre, actually got the whole police report, so too much information, but found out exactly what happened. It was a fire in the kitchen that caused the boat to go on fire. And then by pumping so much water to put out the fire, the ship fell over.
Mm.
And-
Okay.
And so all that stuff, and especially the location of where the World's Fair paintings and sculptures were, it was in a place that they couldn't get it out.
Yeah.
And so during the war, actually, which I think this stuff got cut from the book, but the Germans did many dives there and stole the stuff there too.
Oh,
Basically,
wow.
they were like, wherever we can steal art, we're going to steal it. And so by the time they did the French expedition post-war, they were like, not that much stuff left. They pulled out one of the Bourdelle sculptures and they pulled out a bust and a few other things. But the police report or the excavation report said that most likely the Germans had taken the rest.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Nicole, I have no idea how we're doing. Like, we're so wrapped up here. We could go talking
No,
for like.
We're pretty good on time. It's a
Okay.
6:45, so I
Oh,
just
perfect.
put out another call for if anyone has questions in
Sure.
the audience. We had one
Yeah,
question
I mean, I've
come in
I've
so
got more
far,
to
so you
go,
guys
and
can
I
keep
also-
going.
Yeah, I also asked AI a question, which I thought, hey, was interesting. But I think before we bring AI into it, which is the one. So Rose is the most or the second most decorated woman?
One of the most.
One
So-
of the most decorated.
Perhaps
women.
the most in France. There was another woman from maybe the Netherlands or somewhere who was more in the field. Perhaps I think she was like an airplane pilot. So I realized that she has more. And so it was most safe to say that, but definitely that woman had won more than Rose,
Yeah.
So
So
one of the most decorated women in all of World War II.
why do we think it's taken this long to bring her to the fore?
Yeah. There's been a few reasons. So I mentioned Rose's own personality before.
Right.
But she was quite famous in France post-war because obviously she was getting all these medals, the Medal of Resistance, the Légion d'honneur, which is kind of like France's highest civilian honor, and many other awards, the Medal of Freedom from the United States, in
Yeah.
fact. And then she writes her memoir, 1961. That's optioned into a movie,
Movie, right.
Burt Lancaster, The Train. Holds up pretty well, actually.
Yeah.
Although
I haven't
it's
seen.
mostly a caper about Burt Lancaster, but
Yeah.
Rose, a character based on Rose, shows up in the first few minutes of the film and it kicks off the action. So she was well known, but by the time she dies in obscurity, right? And so one of the things that I was able to dig up during this was the realization that she actually had been silenced after her fame.
Okay.
And so there's a letter that a researcher in France who's working on Rose's post-war life got a hold of, where Rose herself says that she was told by this very famous French minister not to write the sequel to her book. And separately, I knew that the book, her first memoir, had been pulled off the shelf. So the mechanism of that, I don't know.
Mhm.
But what she did after that was she wrote to basically every single library and museum in France and offered the books for free.
Mm.
So she was acutely concerned about her legacy.
Yeah.
And because she was being silenced, right?
Right.
And then, the memoirs of some of these other French curators who have dubious wartime records. One of them publishes it after she dies and starts nitpicking her on like random facts. They can't attack her too much, but throughout he
Yeah.
peppers things. And so I think the combination of sort of this institutional silencing that happened, the other key thing is that she continued to fight for art restitution for the rest of her life.
Yeah.
So she stays in Germany for about 8 years post-war. She's working for the US Army, the French Army. She's working at the collection points where all the art's coming in, where they have to figure out where it goes, what country, and how to restitute this art back to the original owners. So she stays longer than most of the quote unquote monuments men. So she continues to fight there. She comes back. She's still fighting and working with Jewish families and other people who've had their art looted. And that's very clear in her papers. And they were all very grateful. There's those letters that are in the archives. But she comes back during a time that it's now the Cold War.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to talk about Nazi looted art. They feel like they've gotten the big guys at Nuremberg in the French tribunals, the war tribunals, which she actually came back at one point and served as a interrogating prosecutor.
Yo,
Really impressive.
Yeah, really cool.
And so the country wants to move on, the world wants to move on. And so here's this kind of eccentric woman at this point, older woman, still talking about Nazi looted art, wanting to hold powerful French families to account. Some of those French families still in power today. It's like the society there is much like England. It's a very rigid society and
Yeah.
power remains concentrated. So basically, for many reasons, she's being silenced. And so it's not until the late 90s does the Roosevelt Association in her hometown get created. They do a big conference with some famous female resistance members and male resistance members who are still alive. And this kickstarts a revival into Rose, but it's taken still a long time, more than 20 years.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting is that even when she's portrayed in movies and such, even in the Burt Lancaster, her name is changed. So all the opportunities for the greater public to know about her, she doesn't get fame under her own name. Monuments Man too. She's there as Claire Simone and not as Rose.
Oh, that's her character.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah. And then the French book that I mentioned, she's not even in there too.
Yeah.
So somehow she's constantly being erased.
She's also, it seems like she keeps getting erased, yet she's so important. There's a really interesting scene, the really touching scene. I think I got very emotional when she was on the set of the train.
Yeah.
And you've spent this journey with her. I don't think this is given. I hope.
No, we can talk about
Okay.
it. Yeah.
You've spent this journey with her throughout the entire book, and you're in it. You're emotional. You've got the whole thing. And so, towards the end of the book, you write, on the set of the train, a film optioned of her memoir, La Front de l'Art. I can't pronounce French.
Very close.
Then I got it. There were Nazi officers walking around the Rue de Paume again, and sentries out front cocking their guns, and the clip-clop sounds of black boots hitting the floor jolted her back in time. And for a few moments, she forgot that the war had ended, and tears had flooded her eyes, and in confusion, she had at the museum. I don't know what happened, she told the reporter afterwards. I, who am so calm, could not even find the metro station. At long last, this fierce, independent, unflappable woman finally had to confront the demons that she had long pushed aside. She was always unflappable. And that moment
this
was so
20
touching.
This is 20 years after the war.
Insane.
Right? And it's really the first time that she got emotional about it.
Yeah.
Because she was like I mentioned, jolted back
Yeah.
to being in that museum, to being under the nose of the Nazis for 4 years and being told to spy. and the actions she took there and the danger that she was in.
Yeah, and the incredible things that she saw all while doing that, like the atrocities the Nazis were committing, but also scenes when she's trying to escape, which I won't get into because you really should read it. And like how you process that, and all of a sudden, 20 years later, it hits you. So it's just, again, it was such a really good way to humanize Rose that even she had to take a breath at the
And that's the only account I've found where she gets emotional.
Yeah.
All the interviews are very, factual. And what's interesting is that there's only a couple radio interviews that one of them comes from TV, one radio. So in terms of actually hearing her own spoken voice, there's actually not that much material, but there are a lot of newspaper articles. And in all of them, she once again, doesn't talk about any of that. And what I wanted to mention was that when my husband Augustin heard her interview, he said, "Oh, she sounds exactly like how my grandfather spoke." There was a way of speaking that indicated that you came from the educated class and
Okay.
you worked in the civil service.
Okay,
And so that is how she presented herself to the public,
got it.
right? The educated woman that she was.
Yeah,
So she would not reveal any emotions, of course, in these kind of interviews.
very
And
interesting.
so it was actually an Elle magazine interview where this came from, where she got confused and lost. And of course, Elle would probably want to show the woman behind
The woman,
this
right?
movie.
Yeah.
And so that ended up in this article. And actually, an art historian in France had sent that to me. And I just want to add that I'm super grateful to like all the people that have helped me in France and the United States on this book. Like people really opened themselves up and shared their research all over France,
Yeah.
from a woman who's the head of art research in the Louvre, who actually I have her documents. She sent me home to America with all her papers on Rose Valland, and I lugged them back, right? The openness that I received researching this book has been really incredible.
That's amazing. And it shows too. It shows in the quality of the detail and the way you wove those narratives together. So I think for my part, I will end, and you've already answered it, but I thought it was cute. I like to do this sometimes. Look, what does AI want to know about the art spy? And so they had a bunch of questions, but this was the top question. And I thought, oh, go AI.
Yeah.
Rose Valland is often described as the female monuments man. How do you feel her experience both aligns with and differs from the better known male figures in art recovery? You've addressed it, but if I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, but
Well, I think the thing I'll say is that Monuments Man, right?
yeah, exactly.
She's the Monuments Woman. And I think, first of all, she's the woman who collected all the intelligence that the Monuments Men used to
Yes.
find where
She
the
did
Nazis
the hard work, right?
where the Nazis had stashed all the art in Germany and Austria in castles and salt mines. But then she herself goes there and serves as a monuments woman and is crisscrossing Germany and Austria in jeeps and locating the art. Sometimes she's sneaking into the Russian zone.
Yeah,
And so that's all in the last part of the book. And it's actually also super exciting. So I think, she deserves all the accolades that they have. And I think a full picture of who this woman was. And to add, it's not all rosy. She's a very difficult, prickly person.
Yeah.
But that's what made her very suitable to be a spy.
exactly.
Less suitable to go simper in the civil service.
Right. Right, very true.
Yeah.
Well, again, I will just say it is an amazing read, and if you haven't yet, read it. It is.
Thank you so much.
You will enjoy it, and it was a joy for me as a friend
Yeah.
to read it for you. I was like, oh, Michelle. So
I second
yeah,
that.
Nicole, do you have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, we have a few questions that came in, some compliments too. Margaret says, fascinating talk. Robin has the book sitting next to her right now.
Nice. Hey, Robin.
I dropped a couple links in the chat where you can order the book, including a link to get an autographed copy of the book. So we had a question come in from Laura, and Laura wanted to know, why did the Nazis loot so much art? Was it to
Yeah.
appease Hitler, who wanted to set his own standards as those of the government, or was there another
Yeah.
reason, whether political or pragmatic?
This is such a good question, because actually when you mentioned kind of me distilling down a lot of information, this was one of the most difficult things to distill down. That took a lot of time because it was such a concerted effort. So I think that's the first thing to know. And the whole thing originally did stem from Hitler's love of art and Hitler's hatred of modern art. And
Yeah.
his hatred of modern art and all of, well, his whole experience with art stems from his rejection from art school twice in Vienna, and that kickstarts him living as a very poor artist. He's homeless at some point in Vienna, and he starts to formulate his virulent anti-Semitic creeds from here. And this is detailed in Mein Kampf. Do not read Mein Kampf in the dark of the middle of the night. I did that. Well, my baby was like, feeding.
Oh.
I would like test it, write some chapters. But and so art for Hitler and his cronies were a way to establish their knowledge, their cultured aspects. And so they were collecting old masters. So these are Vermeers, Holbein, Rembrandt,
Yeah.
these artists. And they didn't care about the modern art, which now, of course, is so valued today. And so when they went into each country, they would search for the art that they liked,
Yeah.
which the best would go to Hitler, and then they would just start sending decrees after decrees, and then they would fight amongst each other. All the different German players in these countries would fight over who got in charge of the looting. But really, I think the important thing to know is that everything had to be legal and above board.
Yeah.
And so the looting in France, for example, was said to be a simple safeguarding
Yes.
of art for a future peace treaty, because the armistice was just a temporary truce, and Germans expected that the Brits would capitulate at any time, especially with the Blitz that they were about to start. And then at final point, the art would be added in the reparations for this final treaty.
Yeah.
But anytime they stole something, it had to appear legal. They would pretend to pay for it. So it was a very elaborate operation
Yeah.
on many fronts, and then with lots of different players who were fighting for it.
Yeah, and I think from a reader's perspective, what's also fascinating and a little lesser known was Hitler's obsession with his Führer Museum and
Oh,
his
yeah,
legacy,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
why he was earmarking a lot of this art to be the legacy of the right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why I set up the beginning of the book. You meet Rose, but then you go, I don't remember what the exact said, but you go to an art auction
Yeah.
in Lucerne where the art that they all hate has been
Degenerate.
degenerate art
Yeah.
has been pulled from the German museums and are now the best is on sale in Lucerne. And actually many museums in America purchase art, and there's stuff floating around everywhere from this auction. But Joseph Pulitzer Jr. bought a bunch of
Yeah.
stuff.
Bunch of, right.
And then there's another chapter where you meet Hitler's art dealer
Yeah.
as he's going up to
That was very cinematic. Climbing up the
Yeah.
mountain and
going to
yeah.
Berghof,
Yeah,
his headquarters up in the mountains.
Yeah.
And in this chapter, this guy gets chosen to be the curator of the Führer Museum. And this museum is supposed to be the end all be all of all museums, far bigger than
The largest
gallery
museum in the
and
world.
the
Yeah.
largest museum.
Yeah.
And so he's collecting art, and it's supposed to show all the best art from all epochs of German history.
Yeah.
And so it's supposed to be organized by century and stuff. And so he's collecting for that, for the posterity he wants to leave behind. Goring is collecting because he's just a gluttonous
Yes.
person. And he's really the one who dominates the looting in France.
Yeah.
But thanks for that question.
Good question.
Yeah. This question's from Helen, and you kind of talked about it a little bit already, and I don't know how much more you want to give away, but
Yeah.
Helen was curious to know, what did Rose do after the war? Did she stay on as a curator at the Jeu de Paume?
Yeah, so she spends those next 8 years or so in Germany as a restitution person, and she's doing lots of interesting stuff. And I do hope that someone will write or do something about her post-war life. I got to touch on it for the epilogue of the book. But there's a lot of exciting stuff there. It doesn't work quite as well for a narrative nonfiction book because like the action is spread out over time.
Yeah.
But really interesting stuff that she's doing there. And then she comes back, but she has to take basically an assistant curator role. And there are a lot of letters that go back and forth from her supporters and other things stating this. I think one of the ministers even weighs in. And they're basically like, here's this woman who's so renowned in France, so beloved at this point, and she has to go back to her original position in the war. And basically she's told that when she goes to Germany, that's just a secondment of her job. It's sort of a temporary assignment, and she can't get the same pay that she has, so she's got to go back. And so the museums kind of find a place for her. She's shuttled around from office to office, and but she does other stuff as well. She's sort of like a lifelong hustler,
Yeah.
and you'll learn that's kind of I explain how she makes money
Yeah.
before the war when she's unpaid at the museum. And so I found a letter stating, or maybe it was a newspaper article that said that she also worked on restitution for the Rothschild Foundation.
Mm.
So she took different jobs, all in art restitution and other things, to make ends meet. But I would say it seemed like she didn't get the job in the museums that she had always dreamed.
Mhm.
That fell through her grasp.
Yeah.
Like,
This comes from DJ, and if anyone else has any other questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat or the Q&A. Either place works. So DJ says, how long did it take you to research this fascinating woman?
yeah, so the whole process, start to finish, was a little over 4 years. The first year was me, the idea germinating, me showing up in her hometown and getting my hands on things that had been published about her, and then working on the proposal, well, getting an agent first, working on the proposal, and then getting it sold. And then nonfiction books are sold on spec, basically, through a proposal, and then you get you get a portion of your advance to then start working on it. And so that next summer, I went to France and did several months of research. Luckily, having a French family,
Yeah, that helps.
we can go there for 2 months. Augustin actually came with me every day to the archives and helped me with this kind of very initial large phase of gathering information. And then when I came back to New York, I started writing. And actually, the one chapter I wrote beforehand, which I didn't write, most of the book I wrote chronologically, like I said, discovering it,
Mhm.
like you discover it, is the chapter where Alexander Rosenberg flees from the Basque Country, because that's part of where my husband's family is from. So I knew that town like the back
You
of
knew-
my hand.
okay.
And I was like, I can write this. So I wrote that, but that's the only thing I wrote out of order. And then everything else flowed from there. And then, yeah, and then there's like editing, and so there's a lot. And as the editing was happening, more
Yeah.
materials were, the family was giving me more stuff.
Yeah, I remember.
And so, and then I would go to France again. So yeah, it's quite a while. It takes a while.
I can't believe that was 4 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's basically, well, from the minute that I was actively,
Right.
book deal and starting, it's basically the age of it's Emma's age.
Yeah, no, that's right.
This book is the
Oh.
age of my daughter,
Yeah.
who's dedicated to.
Oh.
Aw. And I'm dropping a link in the chat to some of your upcoming book tour events if you want to shout
Yeah.
out any of the places you're going to be.
Yeah, so I'm heading out tomorrow morning again for my 3rd week of book tour. It's actually been really amazing. It's been back-to-back cities all around the country, and for example, St. Louis, like all the other places, packed rooms, but St. Louis had over 200 people, which was
That's crazy.
really
That's
incredible.
amazing.
But every place
St.
is like
Louis.
at least 100 people in the room.
Yeah.
People have really responded to Rosa's story. I had always had a hunch that she would be more popular in America than she was in France. And I think that's true, because I think there's something very distinctly American about her, like, get the job done.
That's great. She's
Attitude.
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or defiance.
Yeah, and her defiance.
defiance,
People
right,
love that here.
Yeah.
So yeah, 2 stops, Cleveland, Columbus. Then I'll be in New Jersey next week, in South Orange, Provincetown a few days after that. We've got the Lit Salon here in Brooklyn, but it's actually
Yeah.
sold
Oh,
out.
yeah.
Yeah, so that's our candlelit salon that we host here with a lot of authors. And then the tour continues, so it's there. So starting in
Yep.
August, September, I'll also
You're going
be-
into the fall too.
Yeah. Yeah, people keep emailing to ask me
That's-
to
that's
participate. So I'm
great.
Very
saying yes to
exciting.
everything. I'm also dropping in a bunch of book clubs.
Oh,
So if you want me to show
Nice.
up virtually in person, I will do it.
That's really cool.
Yeah, I'm really
Oh, very fun.
yeah.
Very fun. And I'll give the last question to Mary Jane, who says, you've done a tremendous job in writing this book and in highlighting Rose as a phenomenal woman. Keep up the good work. Where do you
Oh.
go from here? Are there any other Roses in your future?
Yeah, I discovered a lot of side stories, which I did not have the page space to go down those dark holes. Of course, I did it kind of because I need to know everything.
Yeah.
So I have some World War II stories tabled that I'm working on, but I'm also following a more contemporary story, a more true
Oh.
crime related story that I would like to write. And it's actually something I've been wanting to write for 20 years. And it's sort of popped up in the fore more recently again. So it might be the time. So I have a bunch of things in the fire and hopefully can start working on a new book. But I'm really happy to keep Rose with me longer and share her
Yeah,
with more audiences. So
Yeah, she
Yeah.
needs to be shared, and I think
very
it's
exciting.
amazing.
yeah,
So,
thank you so much,
Yeah.
everyone.
thank you. Thank you guys for
Thank you,
joining us. Thank
Justin.
you, Michelle, for giving me this amazing opportunity to interview you. And we'll see you guys soon.
Amazing.
Yeah, thank you
you.
everyone for tuning in. I dropped a few links in the chat. Obviously, the links to grab a book autographed if you'd like. And then also a link to some upcoming Untapped New York events. We have another virtual book talk on June 11th. We're talking to Mary No, who wrote the book, The Man Who Shot JP Morgan. So we'll have another
Ooh,
true
that
crime
sounds really fascinating.
mystery. Yeah, some false identity, crazy criminal scheming stuff going on there. So hope to see you there and have a great evening, everyone. Michelle and Justin, thank you so
Bye,
much. This was
guys.
great.
Thanks. See you
Bye.
guys soon.